Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashad. Zoe with us today. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. It's the 169th episode of Give the People What They Want. We're now into May of 2024. Happy May Day, friends. Wish we had a special on May Day, Zoe. We could have talked about the May Day protests around the world, but both you and I were on the streets covering the celebration of Workers' Day all across the world. And I must say, once again, it was a miraculous day. Workers, under so much intense pressure from the capitalist system, miraculously found the energy to be out there banging drums on the street and claiming space. While workers were doing that all over the world, they carried flags of Palestine. They stood with Palestine. A lot of protests around Palestine. We're going to come back to that. But I first want to point out that over the last 24 hours, the Israelis bombed Gaza again, killed 26 people, injured 51 people. The slaughter in Gaza has not stopped at all. Already, there continues to be talk in Tel Aviv of incursion into Rafah. The United Nations has warned that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians' lives will be at risk if the Israelis enter Rafah. Israelis have thus far shown they care nothing for the lives of Palestinians. So it's not impossible that in the hours, days ahead, there will be this slaughter of Rafah, which people have talked about. Also, United Nations has said, Zoe, and this is an important point, that there has never been such destruction in a war in a very long time, perhaps since World War II, even including some of the cities in World War II. The estimates that range now, $40 billion is the minimum estimate for rebuilding in Gaza. $40 billion, that's a considerable amount of money that is not on the table. UNRWA has been underfunded. The question of feeding the Palestinians, underfunded. The idea that there would be money for rebuilding in Gaza, simply not on the table. Meanwhile, extremist, illegal Israeli settlers in the West Bank of the occupied Palestinian territory have been attacking homes of Palestinians, attacking land, and so on. Whatever negotiations have been taking place, it is pretty clear that the Israeli governments have been obstructing it. They have an agenda. They want to enter Rafah. They want to destroy, as they have said, Hamas. They are not interested in an agreement before they enter Rafah. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu, who leads the government in Israel, has said that there will be no deal in Cairo until they have finished Hamas off. In other words, and this is why Hossein Badram, top Hamas official, has said that Netanyahu, he said, is the obstructionist. He said he has obstructed previous peace negotiations. He is going to obstruct this one. We're going to come back to the question of peace negotiations, Zoe. I'm going to talk a little bit about the meeting held between Hamas, Fatah, and other factions in China, where they are apparently brokering a deal. I'm going to come back to that. But just to stay on this for now, there's been a lot of focus, as you are going to report, on the protest movement, particularly in the United States around college campuses. Of course, this has been now ballooning around the world. You're going to talk about that. But let's not forget, while the focus is on these college campuses and very brave college students, the Israelis continue to bomb in Gaza. They continue to kill people, hundreds of people during this period of the college encampments. But I think it's nonetheless important for you to tell us what the college students are doing in this period. Why don't you give us a full survey, Zoe? 0 point, New York City.
Well, it has definitely been an exciting and intense couple of weeks across the United States, of course, with a lot of activity across the city of New York. And in the last couple of days, we've seen intense police repression against these encampments. We spoke about it on the show last week about why these encampments were organized at college campuses across the U.S. Just to refresh people again, students who are organized in their Students for Justice for Palestine or different sort of groups and collective on campus launched these protests on the campuses of their universities to demand that the universities divest from Israel, that they divest their holdings, their investments in Israeli companies and other companies that profit from Israeli genocide, Israeli apartheid, and also cut academic ties with Israeli academic institutions, which are part of this broader sort of normalization of Israel's violence and, whole project. So, these are the righteous demands that students have been actually demanding for several years. We're not talking about demands that sprung up right now. We're talking about sustained campaigns over the last decade as part of the BDS movement, as part of the broader movement for Palestine. And amid this genocide, students said, we're tired of just having, meeting after meeting, raising letters to the administration. We're actually going to escalate our action. There's over 35,000 Palestinians that have been killed. Launching an encampment on the campus of the university, that is like the least that we can do, is kind of this sentiment. And so these encampments sprung up across the United States to raise this demand, to intensify this demand. And what we've seen confirmed with the response of the university administrations, with the response of local police, of state police, is that they would rather brutalize students, beat them up, arrest them, than actually listen to this demand, which is divesting from genocide and war, not having the money that's donated so that students can learn and that students can expand their critical thinking, can be trained. They're using money that's brought into the university for this purpose and actually helping Israel further its goal and further its project. So, it's a very simple demand. And again, over 2,000 people have been arrested. This is the current estimate in this crackdown on the encampment movement. We've seen horrific images. For example, from UCLA, there was sustained attacks from Zionist groups, violent Zionist groups that unleashed cockroaches, mice, were shooting fireworks at the encampment, were actually hitting students with pieces of wood, were beating them up. The police did nothing and used this as a pretext to actually intervene and mass arrest and sweep the camp. We've seen now in the past couple of days these mass arrests and crackdowns on the encampment, specifically in New York. We know that Columbia University and City College both suffered this fate. This morning at around 6 a.m., New York University, NYU, as well as the New School, which had encampments for about a week, were also cracked down on. And so essentially, again, the message is we would rather support Israel's genocide than allow students to protest. And so, it's interesting because, of course, right-wing, not even right-wing, liberal talking heads, the mainstream media, university administrations say that we can't allow this climate of anti-Semitism, of discrimination, et cetera, of violence. And of course, it bears repeating just because it's important to say it again. But of course, dozens of Jewish students have been arrested in these crackdowns. At Dartmouth University, where I think over 100 people were arrested, the chair of Jewish studies was beaten up by cops, and now she's banned from campus for 6 months. So all of these excuses by the people in power, whether it's in the university or even Joe Biden, who said that they won't tolerate anti-Semitism and that violent protests will not be tolerated, is just a very weak and tired excuse. Nobody's buying it anymore. And what really they're showing is that, the imperialist interests of the United States, their need to control West Asia, their need to have Israel untouched, just is more important than any other consideration. And they will use every single excuse in the book to back up this interest, and even throwing different communities under the bus while they do that. So it's really horrific. We've seen just the worst incidents of at the university in Mississippi. There were racist insults hurled at students by right-wing groups. I mean, it's just atrocious. And universities, instead of protecting their students and coming to their defense in what is an incredible expression of actually the values of education and critical thinking, they're cracking down. So I think the essay that you wrote at Tricon newsletter is a really beautiful encapsulation of these sentiments of these sensitive students who are, horrified at 7 months of genocide, and they're doing what they can to try to stop it.
And Zoe, inspired by these students in the United States, students across the world have been building encampments, not necessarily to, protest their government's financial entanglements with Israel, which many of them may not have, but in solidarity with the students, the sense that they are on the right side of history. I think there's something quite powerful happening here. Meanwhile, in China, the leaders of, or at least the representatives of Fatah and of Hamas, Fatah being the group formed in the 1950s in the University of Kuwait as a liberation movement for the Palestinian people. Hamas set up in 1987 in Gaza by people close to the Islamic Brotherhood. These two movements have been at each other's throat now for almost 20 years. They've been having a discussion this year, first in Moscow, where they talked about the need for Fatah and Hamas to come together and have a conversation about future government in Palestine. Well, now the second round of this discussion has been taking place in China. Very important. I want to give some context for this. In 2006, the 5 principal leaders of the 5 major factions of Palestinian politics, the leader of Fatah, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhoods, Hamas, the leader of Islamic Jihad, the leader of the 2 left groups, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the 5 leaders who were in prison by the Israelis, political prisoners in a prison right next to Tel Aviv. They met clandestinely in the prison and they drafted what's known as the prisoner's document. It's actually quite a moving text where they argue for the need for Palestinian unity. Now, it's interesting that in all the talk about Fatah and Hamas at each other's throats, there has been almost entire forgetting of the articulation of a call for unity in the prisoner's document. What's interesting about the prisoner's document is that they argue that Palestinian politics needs a new foundation, that having sort of exhausted a certain agenda at the Oslo peace agreement, the surrender, as it were, with the creation of the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian politics needed a new way forward with the 5 major factions in agreement. Very interesting how they said the 5 major factions must be in agreement. The 2 left factions, the 2 factions that come out of the Islamic tradition, and then, of course, Fatah, which is seen as the carrier of the national liberation heritage. These 5 groups actually came together and put forward a view for Palestinian politics, quite interesting. Well, over the years, they've continued to talk to each other. It's not that there's been no communication. But these meetings in Moscow first this year and now in Beijing are very significant. And this particular one is really important because they want to come to the Israelis with a unified posture so that the Israelis don't, and the Americans don't find a way to put these two apart. Like, for instance, the United States says, we don't want Hamas to govern in the Gaza of the future, only Fatah. Well, this division between the Palestinians, they feel, is detrimental to Palestinian politics. So they have been close to an agreement in Beijing. Let's see what comes out of it, because it's a cycle of debate and discussion. You know, these negotiators themselves won't conclude an agreement. They're going to have to talk to their people It's very complicated for the Palestinians because a lot of the leadership is sitting inside the prisons of the Israeli government, political prisoners, many of them held for decades. Communication needs to happen. It reminds me a lot of the period that led to the Good Friday Agreement in the north of Ireland, where the Sinn Féin representatives had to communicate with the provisional IRA. They had to talk to prisoners sitting inside Long Kesh prison, Armagh prison, and so on. It's a similar, very complicated process. The difference being that unlike the British government in the 1990s, the Israeli government is undertaking a genocidal war as we speak against the Palestinians. These negotiations are very complicated. Let's see where they go. You're listening to Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. Today, that's Zoe. Normally, it's Zoe and Prashant, which is why Zoe and I have to rush through a bunch of stories that we've been sitting on. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Really happy to have you with us. I was in the United Kingdom and in Ireland recently and met lots of people who said that their favorite weekly show is Give the People What They Want. They all said that, why haven't we sent in our selfies? And I said, well, we're still waiting for them. Zoe, we're talking about some ugly stuff in the United States. You talked about the kind of zigzags of politics with the encampments, but then the police crackdown. There's another zigzag, which is the question of abortion. A zigzag because there are people fighting for it and there are people fighting against it. Tell us a little about these recent court decisions.
Well, as we know, in 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned. This was a Supreme Court ruling which essentially guaranteed abortion access across the United States. It was never made a law, though. It was just a Supreme Court ruling. And essentially, when it was overturned, there was very sharp criticism against the Democratic Party that has always upheld defense of women's rights, defense of reproductive rights as kind of their banner, but had never actually never had the political will, to be honest, to actually codify and make sure that this right would be protected. And then, of course, it was overturned in 2022 by the very conservative Supreme Court. And this opened the floodgates for conservative states across the US to actually enact whatever sort of legislation restricting abortion that they wanted. Because when Roe v. Wade was in effect, they could add restrictions to the process, such as you have to meet with a psychologist or you have to do X, Y, and Z before getting the procedure. But essentially, it was protected. Now, that is all over. And we've seen that in many states across, especially the US South, conservative lawmakers have enacted extremely restrictive bills, the latest being in the state of Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis, which has, as of May 1st, banned abortions after 6 weeks. As people will know, 6 weeks is extremely early into a pregnancy, with many people actually at this point not knowing they're pregnant. And the big challenge here is that if abortion is banned in the state of Florida, which is, by the way, a huge state in the United States, after 6 weeks, does this mean that women are no longer going to get abortions? No, it just means that the process has become way more complicated, way more dangerous, and much more difficult for poor and oppressed communities in that state. Interesting to add is that the majority of the surrounding states, the neighboring states to Florida, also have extremely restrictive abortion laws. So it's not the case that you can drive an hour, which, in the US, this is a common practice. I know it's a common practice across the world. If the area you're in has restrictive abortion laws, well, you drive to the next state or province, depending on where you are. In the US South, the majority of the states already have abortion bans or extremely restrictive abortion access. So what does that mean? You actually have to drive maybe over 12 hours. So that we're not talking about a day trip to get a medical procedure done. We're talking about taking days off work, expensive trip. This is essentially limiting access to this fundamental reproductive right to of course, the people, working class women, people who don't have the ability to take sick days and all of that. So extremely concerning, especially given the fact that the majority of the population in the United States actually supports the right to abortion. So the decision by these conservative lawmakers is going against the sentiments of the majority of the country, much like, for example, the fact that over 70% of the population does support a ceasefire. But once again, the conservative lawmakers in the US would rather go against, what the people actually want to enact their regressive agenda on women, on oppressed people across the country. So extremely concerning development there. Of course, we know that Joe Biden says that the US is not an authoritarian country and that we listen to our people, but it seems that the needs of women, the voices of women are completely ignored in states across the US.
Hate to bring us from that story, Zoe, which is a very difficult, tough story for a lot of people, families, women, and so on. Hate to bring us from there into another war zone, but that's the nature of the world we live in. And although as reporters we want to report stories that are less painful, well, here we go. We must turn to the stories that are there. Just some hours ago, a rebel group in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a group known as M23, has allegedly seized the mining town of Rubaya. It's a key town because it's one of the hearts of the area that produces a number of minerals that are essential for smartphones. It has to be said that an untold number of people have died in this conflict around the mineral called tantalum, which is extracted from the coltan necessary for the smartphone. Untold number of people have died. At least 7-8 million people have been displaced. And the United Nations says that these 7-8 million people are outside their reach. They can't get them aid and so on. It's very significant because this taking of Rubaya is part of the systematic plundering of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In other words, this is the wealth of the Congo. The Congo has such wealth that it's one of the richest countries in the world, but it has one of the poorest populations. Poor population because these rebel groups, including M23, come in, they take these minerals, they smuggle them out of the country. Nobody is paid any revenue or there's no taxation. And this goes straight into the arms of multinational corporations, benefiting firms such as Apple, Samsung, Huawei, and others. These are all beneficiaries of the fact that M23 is operating in this area and other rebel groups in other areas. Now, what's very important that is to know a little bit about M23. The president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, said that he's alleged several times. United Nations has also actually released a report showing that what Mr. Tshisekedi says is true. They've alleged that M23 is not just a rebel group, but is fully backed by the government of Rwanda. In fact, I must say the US State Department has also said that Rwanda is behind the M23 group. Earlier this week, Emmanuel Macron of France also urged Rwanda to stop the support of M23. He was at a press conference with Felix Tshisekedi. They together stood there, and Mr. Macron, this is interesting. The reason it's interesting that Macron said this is Macron cut a deal a year and a bit ago with Rwanda's President Paul Kagame to effectively apologize for France's role in the Rwandan genocide so that Rwanda would send troops to northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado province, to protect French interests, particularly the multinational corporation France Total and ExxonMobil, which have a joint gas pipeline. The M23 or the March 23 movement has really been very, very active in the eastern part of Congo. It's a serious problem for the Congolese, the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for a range of reasons. I mean, one of them is that that entire eastern parts population has been in distress, has been pushed here and there by this war that has gone on for decades. No end in sight, unfortunately. But meanwhile, the big multinational corporations really benefiting from this. Let's spin back around, Zoe, to the fact of what's happening in Gaza, in Palestine. You and I have been reporting this story along with Prashad for since the very beginning, since October. We have relied strongly on Palestinian journalists in Gaza, been talking to them on the phone, been reading their reports, and so on. I'm very happy to say that the UNESCO, which is the UN Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization's Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize has been given to the Palestinian journalists in Gaza. It's a great honor to them to receive this prize. The ceremony will take place. It just took place yesterday in Santiago, in Chile. I'm very, very happy that this has happened. I mean, it's important in the context of world press freedom. I mean, I don't even know what to say, Zoe. What do you feel about this prize and other things around press freedom?
I mean, I think it is crucially important, and it also just points to the fact that the UN has continually brought up, for example, the attacks that are faced against Palestinian journalists in Gaza, the singling out of these journalists by Israeli forces. And there actually hasn't been much that's changed in these attacks. And yet these journalists continue to report on the ground, uncovering the most horrific crimes. I mean, it's impossible to even understand what the mental toll of reporting on a genocide is, and seeing it with your own eyes, seeing your colleagues be picked off one by one. So I think this recognition is so crucial, but hopefully it will move more and more people to actually, put pressure so that this genocide ends, and that these journalists can, once again, report without bombs dropping over their head, and without, their cars being picked off by Israeli forces and bombed. And, as journalists, of course, I think it's our duty to continue to uplift their voices and continue to understand that an attack against one is an attack against all of us. And that, what is press freedom when people are being, bombed, and then we see the Western reporters here just saying whatever they want to defend Israel's actions. But really, is this new? No, because we know that, for example, there are brave journalists across the world, Julian Assange, a publisher, Prabir Purkayasa, who's currently on his 7th month. I think today is the anniversary of his 7th month of incarceration in New Delhi, India, pretty much for covering the farmers' protests in the country, for being a voice of opposition, and for being a voice of an inconvenient truth. Of course, like Julian Assange, the co-founder of WikiLeaks, who is still facing charges under the U.S. Espionage Act, who might face extradition. It seems like that's pending. There's been a little back and forth about what his recourse is, but attacking journalists who tell the truth is the order of people in power across the globe. So it is a day that we must defend this style of journalism.
That's right. I mean, today is World Press Freedom Day, and they are on our minds. All those who have been attacked so viciously. Yes, Julian Assange, a publisher. Yes, Prabir Purkayasa, an editor. Yes, all those Palestinian journalists, all those friends of ours who lost their life as they tried to cover stories. It's important for people to know that World Press Freedom Day, May 3rd, was established because a meeting was held in Windhoek, Namibia, on that day in 1991, where African journalists came together in this young country to talk about how it was so unfortunate, racist even, that African stories, African journalists were not being lifted up, that the voice of Africans was being entirely denied. So when we celebrate World Press Freedom Day, let's also focus on the fact that there are parts of the world, such as the African continent, underserved. Very happy that our friends at Africa Stream and other places are trying to lift up African voices, which is, of course, what People's Dispatch does. You've been with Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. And I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Zoe, great to be with you again. See you again next week.
See you next week.